Before Albert Einstein became the world's most famous scientist, before the Nobel Prize, before the fame, before the wild shock of white hair that would become his trademark, there was a young man, uncertain of his future and deeply in love. His name, of course, was Albert Einstein, and the woman he loved was Mileva Maric, a brilliant but overlooked physicist in her own right, and one of the few women studying science at the turn of the 20th century. In 1902, while Albert and Mileva were still unmarried, their lives took a dramatic turn. Mileva gave birth to a baby girl. Her name was Lieserl Einstein. Few people today even know she existed, and there's a reason for that. Lieserl was a secret. At the time, Einstein was not yet a legend. He was a struggling academic in his early 20s, trying to find his first stable job. Mileva, a Serbian woman in a male-dominated field, was already facing prejudice from her professors and peers. For a couple like them, having a child out of wedlock was a scandal, one that could destroy both of their reputations, and so Lieserl was hidden away. Born quietly in Mileva's hometown in Serbia, far from the watchful eyes of Zurich society, we know of her existence only because of a series of private letters between Albert and Mileva. In these fragile handwritten notes, Einstein refers to his daughter tenderly by name. He asks about her health, worries that she may have contracted scarlet fever, and wonders when he might finally see her. But then the trail goes cold. After a handful of mentions, Lieserl simply disappears from their correspondence. No photographs survive. No official birth records exist. She vanishes from history, as though she had never been born. What happened to Lieserl Einstein? Historians are still divided. Some believe she died very young, taken by scarlet fever before her life had truly begun. Others argue she may have been given up for adoption, her identity erased to protect Albert's budding career. Whichever is true, the silence is deafening. Lieserl's story remains a haunting mystery, a shadow on Einstein's otherwise well-documented life. Imagine this: the man who gave the world a new way to see the universe, the man who forever changed our understanding of space and time, may have carried with him, in the quiet corners of his heart, the grief of a daughter lost. A daughter the world would never meet. 2 years after the mystery of Lieserl, Albert and Mileva's lives took another turn. In May of 1904, their first acknowledged child was born, a boy named Hans Albert Einstein. Unlike his sister, Hans's place in history would not be erased. He would grow up under the weight of the most famous surname in science. Hans's early years were anything but stable. His parents' marriage was already under pressure. Albert was consumed with his work, chasing the ideas that would soon transform physics forever. Mileva, brilliant but often sidelined, felt neglected, frustrated, and trapped in Einstein's growing shadow. Their household was filled with arguments, tension, and long absences, a difficult environment for a young boy trying to find his place in the world. As Einstein's career began to rise, the family moved across Europe, from Bern to Zurich and later to Berlin. Hans was often caught between his mother's struggles and his father's relentless drive for discovery. By the time Albert and Mileva's marriage collapsed in 1919, Hans's world had already been shaped by instability. After the divorce, he stayed primarily with his mother, while Einstein moved on with his life in Germany and later in America. Despite these hardships, Hans was determined to carve out his own identity. He chose not to follow directly in his father's footsteps into theoretical physics, but instead pursued a practical path in engineering. He specialized in hydraulics, dedicating his life to the study of rivers, sediment, and dams. He would eventually become one of the world's leading experts in water management, but his relationship with his father was complicated. Einstein, ever the perfectionist, often criticized Hans's career choices, even dismissing his research as unimportant compared to physics. Their bond grew strained, and the tension only deepened when Hans fell in love with a woman whom Einstein strongly disapproved of. Against his father's wishes, Hans married her anyway, a decision that widened the gap between them for years. And yet, in spite of the distance, Hans built a meaningful career and life of his own. He later emigrated to the United States, escaping the rise of Nazism in Europe, and eventually became a respected professor at the University of California, Berkeley. While history remembers him mainly as Einstein's son, Hans Albert earned his own legacy as a pioneer in hydraulic engineering, a man who literally reshaped the way water flows through our modern world. Still, behind the achievements, there was always the lingering shadow of his father's brilliance, and a relationship that never quite found peace. In July of 1910, Albert and Mileva welcomed their second son and their youngest child, Eduard Einstein. Unlike his brother Hans, who grew up under the tension of his parents' failing marriage, Eduard was born into a family already marked by cracks. But from the start, Eduard stood out. As a boy, Eduard, affectionately called Tet by his family, was quiet, sensitive, and remarkably gifted. He loved poetry, literature, and above all, music. Where Albert's mind lived among the stars and equations, Eduard's heart was drawn to the world of art, philosophy, and the human spirit. He spoke with unusual depth for a child, and many believed he inherited his father's brilliance, but expressed it through creativity and feeling rather than mathematics. Albert adored Eduard in those early years. He once wrote that Eduard was his treasure, and the two shared a bond that was softer, more tender than the one Albert had with Hans. Perhaps Einstein saw in Eduard the reflection of something he himself had lost, a gentleness that balanced his own intensity. As Eduard grew older, his talents blossomed. He studied medicine at the University of Zurich with a dream of becoming a psychiatrist. He was fascinated by the human mind, by the mysteries of thought and emotion. He admired Sigmund Freud and wanted to dedicate his life to healing others. Friends described him as witty, kind, and deeply introspective. But in his early 20s, Eduard's promising life began to unravel. Subtle changes at first, long periods of sadness, confusion, and withdrawal. Then, more dramatic episodes. He was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that at the time was poorly understood and often treated with harsh, ineffective methods. The diagnosis shattered his future. His dreams of practicing psychiatry slipped away. Instead of helping others with their minds, Eduard would spend much of his life fighting to keep his own mind intact. Albert, by then already a celebrated figure in Berlin, struggled to cope. At first he tried to support Eduard, but as the illness worsened and Einstein's career demanded more of him, the father grew distant. When Einstein emigrated to America in the 1930s, escaping Nazi Germany, Eduard remained behind in Switzerland. Mileva, already carrying the heavy burden of divorce and financial struggles, became his primary caretaker. Eduard's life from then on was marked by hospital stays, electroshock therapy, and long periods of institutionalization. His letters reveal a sharp mind still capable of beauty and insight, but locked in a body and brain that betrayed him. He once wrote with heartbreaking clarity, "I have the feeling that I am a stranger to myself." Eduard Einstein lived until 1965, passing away in Zurich at the age of 55. He spent his last decades mostly alone, tucked away in clinics and hospitals, a forgotten figure in the shadow of a father who had become a global icon. The story of Eduard is one of the most tragic in the Einstein family. A boy born with sensitivity and brilliance, adored by his father as a child, only to be abandoned by circumstance, illness, and time. His life reminds us that even in the families of great men, tragedy can strike with unrelenting force. When the world thinks of Albert Einstein, we think of genius. We see him scribbling equations on blackboards. We see him posing with his tongue sticking out. We see the Nobel laureate whose theories reshaped the universe. But rarely do we picture him at home in the role of a father. And that is because Einstein's record as a parent was complicated. The letters he left behind paint a portrait of a man caught between two worlds, one of scientific discovery and one of human responsibility. On the one hand, there are moments of tenderness. In his correspondence with his sons, Einstein occasionally wrote with warmth, offering advice, jokes, and expressions of love. He once told Hans Albert, "One is a father but never stops being a child." It was a rare admission of vulnerability from a man otherwise consumed by logic. But there was also distance, long cold stretches of silence. When Einstein and Mileva's marriage fell apart, the children suffered the most. Hans Albert resented his father's absence, and Eduard, who needed emotional closeness perhaps more than anyone, felt abandoned as Einstein immersed himself in his career in Berlin and later in Princeton. For much of their lives, his children lived under the shadow of letters sent across oceans, rather than the comfort of a father present at home. Einstein, for all his brilliance, often struggled with human intimacy. He was impatient, sometimes critical, and not always equipped for the everyday tenderness children need. His focus was relentless. The mysteries of the cosmos demanded everything he had, and often it came at the cost of his family's happiness, and yet he was not without regret. In later years, Einstein admitted that fatherhood had left him conflicted, that while he had given so much to the world, he had perhaps failed those closest to him. His genius may have stretched to the edges of the universe, but when it came to the fragile, messy business of family, Einstein was in many ways just as lost as the rest of us. Of all the chapters in Einstein's family life, none is more haunting than that of his first child, the forgotten daughter. Lieserl. We return to 1902. Lieserl is born in Mileva's hometown in Serbia. She is cradled by her mother, watched over by Mileva's relatives while Albert continues his work in Switzerland. We know from Einstein's letters that he worried about her health, even fearing she had contracted scarlet fever. He asks Mileva how their baby is doing, whether she is recovering, whether she is thriving. His words carry concern but also distance, as if even then Lieserl was already slipping beyond his grasp. And then, silence. The letters that follow make no further mention of Lieserl. She disappears from the correspondence entirely, as though she never existed. There is no record of her growing up. No school enrollment, no photographs, no trace of her name in official documents. The child who had once been written about with tenderness vanishes into a void of history. What happened to Lieserl Einstein? Historians can only speculate. Some believe she died as an infant, likely from scarlet fever, a cruel but common illness of the time. Others argue she may have been given up for adoption, her identity erased to protect Albert's reputation as his career began to take off. In that era, an illegitimate child could have been devastating for a young academic seeking respectability. The truth may never be known. What we do know is this: Albert Einstein never spoke publicly of Lieserl, not once. Even in later years when he reflected on his family, her name never appeared. It was only with the discovery of his private letters, long after his death, that the world even learned she had been born. And so, Lieserl remains a ghost in the Einstein story, a daughter who lived only in whispers and half-truths. Whether she died young or lived under another name, her absence is one of the great mysteries of the Einstein family. For a man who revealed so much about the universe, this silence speaks volumes. Lieserl's vanishing reminds us that even legends carry secrets, and sometimes those secrets are buried in the most personal places of all. As the 1930s unfolded, the world around the Einstein family was changing rapidly and dangerously. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime made life increasingly perilous for Jewish families in Europe. For Albert Einstein, who was already a target for his outspoken political views, Germany was no longer safe. He fled to the United States, eventually settling in Princeton, New Jersey. His son Hans Albert soon faced the same choice. In 1938, Hans emigrated to America with his wife and children, determined to build a new life far from the violence consuming Europe. While his father pursued theoretical physics and became an icon in Princeton, Hans charted a very different course. He devoted himself to civil engineering, with a focus on the science of rivers and waterways. At first glance, it may have seemed unremarkable compared to the grand mysteries of relativity. But Hans's work was groundbreaking in its own right. He became one of the world's leading experts on sediment transport, the way water carries sand, gravel, and soil. His research helped shape modern dam design and flood control, work that protected countless communities and transformed how we harness rivers. In the United States, Hans finally stepped out from the long shadow of his father's fame. He rose to prominence as a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught generations of engineers. Colleagues admired his rigor and independence, noting that he had built a reputation not because of his last name, but because of his contributions. Yet for all his achievements, Hans never fully escaped the tension with his father. Einstein disapproved of Hans's marriage to Frida Knecht, believing she wasn't the right partner for him. Their disagreements created lasting strain. Even as Hans built a respected career and raised a family, the distance between father and son remained. Letters exchanged between them reveal formality rather than warmth. Two brilliant men, forever unable to bridge the emotional gap. Still, Hans Albert Einstein left behind a legacy of his own. His students remembered him as a passionate teacher. His research remains influential in engineering today. He was, in his own way, a builder, not of theories about the cosmos, but of practical solutions that shaped the physical world around us. Hans may have carried the burden of a famous name, but in America, he proved that he was far more than just Albert Einstein's son. While Hans Albert was building a new life in America, Eduard's story was taking a tragic turn back in Switzerland. As a young man, Eduard was full of promise, sensitive, thoughtful, and artistic. He stood apart from his father's world of equations and physics. He wrote poetry, played piano, and devoured the works of great thinkers. He dreamed of becoming a psychiatrist, fascinated by the mysteries of the mind. In those years, Einstein often called him Tete with affection, and some say Eduard was the child Albert felt closest to. But in his early 20s, everything began to change. Eduard started showing signs of mental illness, unpredictable moods, long periods of depression, and increasing detachment from reality. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with schizophrenia, a devastating and poorly understood condition at the time. At first, Albert tried to help, but his life was already pulling him in another direction. The rise of the Nazis forced Einstein to emigrate to the United States. Eduard, too fragile to travel, remained behind in Zurich. Mileva, already burdened by financial struggles and the pain of divorce, became her son's full-time caretaker. Eduard's illness worsened. He was in and out of psychiatric hospitals, often subjected to the harsh treatments of the era, including electroshock therapy and heavy sedatives. What had once been a bright and lively mind dimmed under the weight of his condition and the primitive treatments forced upon him. Letters from Eduard reveal a man painfully aware of his own decline. In one, he confessed, "I have the feeling that I am a stranger to myself." It is a haunting sentence, a glimpse into the torment of a man who could articulate his suffering but could not escape it. Albert Einstein, meanwhile, continued his life in Princeton, working on scientific theories, lecturing, and becoming an international icon. Though he never stopped caring for Eduard, the distance, both physical and emotional, became permanent. Einstein once admitted that his greatest sorrow was his inability to help his youngest son. But the demands of history and the Atlantic Ocean kept them apart. Eduard spent the final decades of his life in psychiatric institutions. After Mileva's death in 1948, he was left almost entirely alone, a forgotten figure in the shadow of his famous father. He died in 1965 at the age of 55 in Zurich, where his story had begun. Eduard's decline is perhaps the most tragic chapter in the Einstein family saga. A boy of extraordinary sensitivity and promise, undone by illness, abandoned by circumstance, and ultimately remembered only as a quiet footnote to a father's towering legacy. His story is a sobering reminder that genius cannot shield a family from heartbreak. As the years passed, the distance between Albert Einstein and his children grew wider. Hans Albert, though accomplished in his own right, never fully reconciled with his father. Their relationship was cordial but not warm. Letters between them often read more like professional memos than exchanges between a father and son. Even when they did share moments of connection, a quiet formality lingered, a wall built out of years of criticism, disappointment, and emotional absence. For Eduard, the estrangement was even more painful. Though Albert had once cherished his youngest son, Eduard's illness created a chasm that was never bridged. When Einstein left Europe for America, Eduard remained behind, his schizophrenia worsening. Albert carried the guilt of leaving him, but he felt powerless to change the situation. In his later years, Einstein would tell friends that his deepest sorrow was his inability to help Eduard. Yet the reality was that the demands of fame and history kept him far from his son's side. Even Lieserl, the daughter whose very existence was erased from public view, haunted Einstein in silence. Whether she died in infancy or lived under another name, we may never know. But what is clear is that Einstein chose never to speak of her, not even to his closest confidants. And so, behind the smiling photographs and the iconic image of the world's greatest genius, there was a man carrying deep regrets. Regret for the daughter lost in secrecy. Regret for the son lost to distance and resentment. Regret for the youngest son lost to illness. In private, Einstein admitted that he was often torn between two worlds, the call of discovery and the call of family. The universe demanded his brilliance. His family needed his presence. He gave the first, and in many ways withheld the second. It is easy to celebrate Einstein as the genius who redefined space and time, but to his children, he was not a figure of legend. He was a father, flawed, distant, and at times painfully absent. A man who achieved immortality in science, but struggled with the ordinary. Fragile bonds of love. When we look back at the Einstein family, the children's lives tell a story that is far more complex than the legend of their father. First, there is Lieserl, the daughter lost to history. Whether she died of scarlet fever as an infant or was given up for adoption remains one of the great mysteries in the Einstein saga. Her name does not appear in public records. No photograph of her survives, and yet her brief life casts a long shadow. Lieserl represents not only a family secret, but also the fragile humanity of a man the world saw as a giant. Then there is Hans Albert. Of the three children, he built the most enduring legacy. As a pioneering hydraulic engineer in America, he contributed research that still shapes how we design bridges, dams, and waterways. He raised a family of his own, and today Einstein's only direct descendants come from Hans's line. His children and grandchildren have lived quieter lives, far removed from the glare of Albert's fame. Some became academics, some pursued the arts, but none sought the spotlight that once surrounded their grandfather. And finally, Eduard. His life was marked not by achievements in the public eye, but by a private struggle with mental illness. He left behind no great inventions, no textbooks, no children to carry on his name. And yet his story remains profoundly important. Eduard reminds us that genius and tragedy can exist within the same family, and that even in a household touched by brilliance, vulnerability and suffering still have their place. Together, the three children of Albert Einstein form a tapestry of mystery, resilience, and sorrow. They show us that behind every legend lies a family, one shaped by love, by loss, and by the complicated ties that bind parents to their children. The Einstein children may never be as famous as their father, but their stories endure, not because of equations or theories, but because they reveal the human side of a man who often seemed larger than life. Albert Einstein is remembered as a man who unlocked the secrets of the universe. His theories reshaped our understanding of space, time, and energy. His name became a synonym for genius, and yet, when we peel back the layers of legend, we discover a far more fragile human story. Behind the chalkboards filled with equations, behind the smiling photographs and the public acclaim, Einstein was also a father, one who struggled, one who made mistakes, one who carried regrets. His daughter Lieserl vanished into silence, a secret never spoken aloud. His son Hans Albert carried his father's name but bore the weight of distance and disapproval. And his youngest, Eduard, lived a life of heartbreaking decline, defined not by possibility but by illness and isolation. In many ways, Einstein's children reveal the paradox of his life. To the world he gave clarity, unveiling truths about the very fabric of reality. But within his own family the picture was messy, complicated, and incomplete. The man who taught us that time and space are relative could not always bridge the distances in his own home. And yet, this is precisely what makes his story universal. Because no matter how brilliant, no matter how celebrated, Einstein was not immune to the struggles of love, parenthood, and loss. He was, in the end, a man who sought to understand the stars, but who also stumbled, as we all do, in the most human parts of life. The untold story of Lieserl, Hans and Eduard does not diminish Einstein's genius. Instead, it reminds us that even the greatest minds live lives shaped by joy and sorrow, by triumph and regret, and that sometimes the most profound truths are not written in equations but in the fragile bonds between parent and child.